Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Stephen with the Flint Genesee Chamber of Commerce. I want to say thank you for joining us this afternoon on this, well, really beautiful afternoon. I saw we're looking at a high of 57 or something. Today we're joined by Attorney Dean Yotis, lifelong Flint resident, I just learned as we were talking before we started. This afternoon we're talking about employment law. We're going to address some questions around unemployment. I think with that, Dean, I'd like to hand it over to you. Dean has some things that he'd like to share, and then what we're going to do is open it up for question and answer. So as you're listening, if something triggers a question for you, please comment that in the chat, either on Facebook or YouTube Live, and we'll do our best to answer the questions. But keep in mind, all of this, these are all new things happening. Everything's happening very quickly. Dean may not have the answer, but we're going to do our best to give you the most accurate information. Is that right, Dean? Is that the best way to say it?
That's correct.
Good.
That's very accurate, Steve.
With that, Dean, please take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. In this new era of this new age of coronavirus, there's been a lot of impact, obviously, on the employment setting and employment law. Most of which is so new that people are trying to work their way through the process, both employees and employers. And there's been some guidelines, some new legislation, and some guidelines following up on reasonable interpretations of new legislation impacting coronavirus. Of course, we have the governor's order, which had a huge impact on employment in Michigan. There's only two categories of instances in which you're allowed to leave home to go to work. One is if you've been deemed, quote, necessary to sustain life. And the other is if you're not in that category of individuals necessary to sustain life, you can go to work in order to, quote, conduct minimum basic operations. And that has some very specific definitions that we can get into later if anybody's interested. We also have a new piece of legislation called the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which is essentially an expansion of the Family Medical Leave Act. Key feature there is it's a mandatory, if an employee is experiencing COVID-19 related symptoms or been diagnosed positively, there's a mandatory 2 weeks paid sick leave required by the employer under this expanded Family Medical Leave Act called the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And an employee, a small employee, can apply for an exemption, but it's not clear at all how they're going to be exempt. And again, there's more definitions that explain a lot about this, but it's pretty clear that everyone is required to pay employees under certain COVID-related circumstances. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has not stated affirmatively that a coronavirus infection or COVID-19 infection is or does constitute a disability. They've been silent on that so far. So it's not clear at all that the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act under federal law, or the State Persons with Disabilities Act would even apply in this situation. Then you have in the employment setting concerns about the right to privacy as it relates to COVID-19 infections. And just recently, there's been some guidelines to employers that allow when they find out that a employee has tested positively for a COVID-19 infection, that they are allowed to inform coworkers who work in proximity of that individual. And as long as it's narrowly communicated it appears that that would not constitute an invasion of privacy or other laws. And I'm not exactly sure about how HIPAA works on this, but there is guidance that says, hey, in this era with COVID-19, you are allowed as an employer to communicate to, we'll just say, other coworkers, other employees on a need-to-know basis. We also have the, under the CARES Act, a great extension of unemployment benefits, in addition to what I'll call a federal supplement of an additional $600 a week for unemployment benefits, in addition to what Michigan already provides. We have self-employed individuals now eligible, independent contractors eligible for unemployment, and others who could never participate in the unemployment system in Michigan because they simply didn't qualify for benefits. The federal supplement, the $600 supplement to what Michigan already pays for unemployment benefits, I believe that's going to be only for months. And probably, I think it ends around the end of July. So people will get a significant benefit in the state of Michigan when you combine the Michigan unemployment benefits with the federal benefits. You can't get unemployment if you quit your job, unless there's what they call good cause attributable to your employer, which that can be decided on a case-by-case basis, but there has to be a real good reason. So that's kind of the landscape of employment law right now in the age of coronavirus. I think there's going to be a lot more information that we receive concerning guidelines. In fact, things are changing on a day-to-day basis. But now there's a lot of people, a lot of employees who are confused, and a lot of employers who are confused. We'll be waiting on the governor's guidance in her next order, and we'll be waiting on the interpretation of some of the new legislation on the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and how family medical leave expansion applies. In addition to the two-week paid sick leave that employers are going to be required to pay employees who are experiencing COVID-related symptoms. There's also child care provisions for caretakers who have school-aged children who have a school closure where there has to be paid 2/3 of their pay for up to 10 weeks. Now, again, there'll be some more guidance I would expect on this, but that's what the statute says right now. The unemployment coverage, people are finding out different things every day. It's difficult to get through to make a claim, and then once you make a claim, there's no guarantee that you're actually going to get the money. There's certain certifying requirements, and it's all going to get played out soon. But there's no question that the intent is to provide individuals, or a lot more individuals, with unemployment benefits than we're used to. And that's basically the overview of employment now. And I expect you'll see a lot of changes in the future. And what I'm thinking at this point is a question and answer might be the best way to address individual information concerns, because so many of these situations are very fact intensive, and we really need to know what the fact is in any particular situation to give guidance.
Right. Thanks, Dean. So I see one question so far. We'll do that one first. Question is, can employers demand that employees not tell other employees themselves? I'm assuming, does that mean if they were diagnosed or something in that regard? If you could clarify there, Brenda. But let's ask the question that way. If someone's diagnosed, can the employer demand that the employee not share that information with other colleagues?
Right. Well, I think you have a situation where the first place I would want to know more information is, are these other colleagues or coworkers people who work within the same work environment closely, or do they work on a different shift where they don't come into contact with certain people? I'm just going to say, as a matter of common sense, there's no guideline on this necessarily, but if a coworker, if an employee is concerned legitimately about the health and safety of a coworker, and they communicate that in good faith, I do not see how an employer can demand that they not speak about it. I think that in these times right now, I think that employer could be potentially be opening up themselves up for first legal liability, and second, a lot of criticism from the public. I think that as we know more facts about a given situation, though, we can get more precise in counseling any given employer. It just depends on the situation, though. How much is there a need to know for this employee to protect their welfare, their health?
Mhm. Okay, and that was the question. So thanks, Dean, for that.
Yeah.
Another question along the same line: an employee is diagnosed with coronavirus. What's step one, step two? How should employers handle a situation like that?
Right. Well, if first of all, an employer, let's backtrack a little bit. Under the governor's order, and common sense too, but under the governor's order, you have to maintain a work environment that has adequate precautions in place so that people can come to work and be safe and feel safe. So the governor's order requires social distancing, and work cannot be set up so that there'll be violations of the 6 feet social distancing spacing that is required under the governor's order. Um, the governor has indicated that there should be some type of, let's just say, cleaning plan to disinfect certain common areas in the workplace. And I think that's a proactive way to protect employees and protect the employer as well. So before you even have people come in, I think it's a good idea to have some type of policy about how you're going to create a safe work environment free from coronavirus. And Steve, the question related again, could you repeat the exact question in this case?
Yeah, if an employee of yours is diagnosed with coronavirus, what should be the employer's step one,
Right.
step two? Yes.
Right. So, we've talked about how being proactive before you even hear about an employee being diagnosed positively with COVID-19, but you should take a step of telling that person they're not allowed to come in to work. Okay. And because if they do, obviously it's a risk to the other employees.
Mhm.
And if you can prove, for example, that a individual contracted COVID-19 in the workplace, that's a workers' compensation claim, among other things, possibly, but certainly a workers' compensation claim. And obviously, you don't want to be responsible morally or any other way, legally or any other way, for getting somebody sick. But I think the law requires, and the governor's order requires, that that person stay at home.
Mhm.
And so you would want to receive some type of indication that the person is symptom free. Know that they isolated themselves for a period of time, appropriate period of time, and that it's safe for them and they're not contagious when they come back into the workplace.
Okay. So with the same kind of line of thought, when the stay home, stay safe is lifted, or we start to transition back to work, specifically with regards to health screenings, say if we're checking temperatures, can you comment on that specifically? How should employers handle ensuring that there's a safe workplace to return to?
That's obviously an excellent question. There's going to be, I'm sure, more information and guidance provided by the federal and state government in that regard. Other than social distancing and the disinfecting of common areas, as far as temperatures go, is there going to be training required on this? Is there going to be mandatory temperature taking? I really don't know. And I'm not sure in a particular smaller employment setting how that would be administered.
Mhm.
So I'd be a little bit surprised if it was mandated in a smaller employment setting. Could it be required, at a General Motors facility, something like that? I could see that happening, but I think it's probably too early to tell if that's going to be required of an employer.
Mhm. Okay.
But the social distancing will certainly be required. The disinfecting,
Right.
will no doubt be required. All steps to keep a smaller footprint of people in a smaller area will be required as well. So, and again, I think these are really common sense based on things that we've already learned,
Right.
but it's going to be important for employers to adhere to them.
Mhm. Shifting gears a little bit, unemployment, claiming unemployment. You mentioned in your comments that self-employed individuals are eligible for. What if someone recently became self-employed, say early in 2020, and maybe they were denied or declined? What should that person do?
Well, as I understand the law on this expanded federal supplement, if you had a business and I think the date is as of February 15th, 2020, then you are eligible
Mm-hmm.
for the expanded or supplemental unemployment benefits. And if the second part of your question, if they were denied, that doesn't necessarily mean you won't get them, because as I understand how the process is working, people who were not eligible traditionally under Michigan unemployment benefits have been denied initially, and then they found that they've been eligible for this supplement later.
Mm-hmm.
And they have not been required, from my experience so far, to refile. They've just been kind of reached out to them and let them know that, hey, you may be eligible for this. They have what's called the certification requirement under the old Michigan unemployment law and under the new law. And I'm not sure what the certification requirement would be for self-employed. I know that for someone traditionally who's an employee and laid off or terminated, they'll just say, hey, I was laid off or terminated and I'm not making any money. But if you're self-employed, one of the questions they ask you, have you been impacted by COVID-19?
Mm-hmm.
And then when it comes to certification, I'm not sure what you have to certify or inform them about your income at this point. I'm sure there'll be questions regarding income, but this is all new, so I don't know exactly what they're going to be asking.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that we received early on, with unemployment from the state as well as the supplemental dollars from the federal source, employers were having I would call it an issue where their employees wanted to be laid off, were trying to be laid off.
Right.
Can you talk about that? What can an employer do in a situation like that where they're trying to be unemployed, if that's the best way to phrase it?
Right. Well, I think you accurately stated what's happening. I think for a large number of people, it's more desirable to be on the unemployment benefits, which could equal around 900 something dollars a week,
Hmm.
than actually going into work and getting paid most of the time less,
Hmm.
and possibly be subjected to a work environment that you're uncomfortable with because of the coronavirus or otherwise. So, it's a real concern for a lot of employers.
Hmm.
I don't think this is something that we're used to as employers, and I don't think it's something that's, a lot of employees have experienced before, where they actually wanted to get laid off
Hmm.
because either A, they're making more money on
Hmm.
unemployment, B, they're kind of scared of contracting the virus at work, or C, a combination of both.
Hmm.
So I think it's going to be um, more difficult than usual to fill certain positions for employers, and particularly those who are going to participate in this Payroll Protection Act,
Hmm.
where you are provided the possibility of a forgivable loan,
Hmm.
um, up to 2.5 times your payroll during a given period of time, and certain utilities and rent, or you have to show that your payroll is equivalent. And there might be some challenges for the reasons that we're talking about right now.
Right.
An employer, though, who offers an employee their job back, so to speak, let's say had been furloughed in the earlier stages of the coronavirus crisis because we're all trying to figure things out,
Hmm.
but later, and because of the governor's order, for example,
Hmm.
later the governor changes the order to allow work to start happening again in this particular employer's situation. The employer who offers that employee their job back, uh, that would trigger an ending of the person's unemployment benefits if they refuse that work.
Hmm.
So um, when an employer tenders that uh, offer of employment back, the employee cannot refuse it and continue to get unemployment benefits.
That Thanks for touching on that. The Paycheck Protection Program. That was a question too that you addressed. Um,
Right. Now, one thing that I've found interesting, because I think the Payroll Protection Act is silent on this, but I've heard people say that seem to know what they're talking about, but I can't guarantee this. It is the Payroll Protection Act, not necessarily the particular Employee Protection Act.
mhm.
And even though the law is intended to protect, people's jobs, if the question is, can an employer replace another employee with someone else as long as they're paying the same amount of money and still have the loan forgiven? I've talked to several people who seem to think that that is permissible. I don't know that for sure, but that'll be an interesting question.
Mhm.
And
I
and particularly because of the concerns about individuals who would prefer to be on unemployment than come back to work.
Right. So you're kind of describing. I've heard. It's based on FTE and the payroll. So what you're talking about is, say I leave this person on unemployment and I bring a new person in, as long as the FTE count is still accurate. Is that okay? Is that what you're describing?
Yes, this is what certain individuals have communicated their understanding is,
Hmm.
but I'm not certain on that, and that's going to it's going to become more clear as we move forward, but
Right.
that is a possibility.
Right. I have a question here. I'm going to put it up on the screen. Is the supplemental $600 unemployment paid even if you receive, let's say, a back pay from your employer a month in after your claim is in progress and you've gotten unemployment pay already?
I think the very important thing to do here is when you're certifying with the state of Michigan, just be honest about what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
If they're asking you about income, read the question very carefully,
Mm-hmm.
respond truthfully, and it will all get sorted out the way it's supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
If there's certain kinds of income, let's just put it this way, generally speaking, there's certain kinds of income that can reduce your level of unemployment benefit that you're going to get at any given period of time, and certain that won't. Again, I'd have to know more about this particular situation.
Mm-hmm.
Did they earn it at a time before they filed for unemployment and receive it during the period? You know, these are things I'm not sure of.
Yeah.
And the most important thing, though, is to answer the questions correctly, because unfortunately, people get into trouble sometimes when they don't answer or don't provide information concerning certain income they received during the relevant unemployment benefit period. So just answer the question as accurately as possible, and it will get sorted out.
And at the end of our conversation, I'll share Attorney Dean Yodis's contact information to his office and an email address if anyone has questions that they'd like to follow up on. The next question, do employees who work less than 30 hours still receive the additional $600?
You know, that's a good question. I would say that because of the expansive nature of this CARES Act, that there's a good chance that they do. I'm not aware of whether or not that's certain. I haven't read anything that says somebody who's working less than full time can receive the full $600, but I believe that they're reaching out to so many people, employees and otherwise, who have not traditionally received unemployment benefits because of the seriousness of the and the difficulty in finding employment and all the layoffs and terminations. I would not be surprised if an employee was still allowed to receive that $600.
Okay.
I mean, there's always been underemployment, for a certain amount. But I think that even though I can't answer that question definitively, I would not be surprised if there ends up being a ruling that they're entitled to the full $600.
And another kind of follow up to the previous question, the pay is a severance. If that helps you, Dean, to answer that question a little further.
Right. Well, even before this coronavirus crisis, my experience with severance pay is you'll still get your unemployment benefits. It'll take longer because you don't get them in the period in which you're receiving the severance, or they're at a reduced rate. But you're still entitled to receive unemployment benefits. And you have to declare when you certify that you have in fact are receiving severance. Now, I don't know whether it's a lump sum or they're getting paid by the week, but the end result's going to be they'd still be entitled to unemployment benefits, but they won't kick in as quickly because of this other income. But they're not denied unemployment benefits because they're receiving severance. And I don't even think it's going to be reduced at this point.
Thanks,
Delayed,
Steve.
yeah.
I keep muting. My doorbell rang and the dog's barking. One of the of working from home. I'm not seeing. We've tackled all the questions in the chat. Dean, is there anything over the course of this conversation that's come to mind that you'd like to share before we close out?
This whole landscape's changing on a day-to-day basis, and I think people are just going to have to take the employment setting on a day-to-day basis. It's obviously very important to people, and they're concerned about their future and how you're going to earn a living, and employers are how you're going to generate money at the business. But this is in flux. The medical issues have not been resolved, and I think employment law in general is trying to adapt to the combination of concerns about safety and concerns about having a viable economy and economic future. So there'll be laws, new laws, there'll be laws changing, there'll be laws interpreted differently over time and guidelines. But one thing's for certain, for the foreseeable future, try to social distance, try to wash your hands, try to disinfect if you're an employer, and hopefully there'll be a vaccine sooner than later.
Exactly. Attorney Dean Yotis, thanks for joining us today. This, as you said it, the information is changing. Before we go, do you have any advice on where employers might go for the most up-to-date information? I know we're doing our best to share that on our website and whatnot, but for employers, where would you recommend they go?
Well, I'm not saying it because you're here, but you guys have done a really good job. The Chamber's done a really good job of having a number of webinars and providing a lot of resources and information regarding this crisis. So I think that'd be a good place to look. The law itself, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, lays out in detail certain employee rights and obligations of the employer. That, I believe, is easily accessible online. That would be a definite place that I would look.
Mm-hmm.
The CARES Act talks in detail about the expanded unemployment benefits. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, they're providing some information. As I said earlier, they're not calling this a disability, but they do put guidelines out there on issues like right to privacy, other things that employers and employees, I'm sure, would like to know. I think that the wage and hour divisions of both the federal and state government have some enforcement duties regarding some of this legislation. So if you went and looked in the state of Michigan's wage hour division or the federal Department of the Wage Hour Division, that might be another good resource. I think the U.S. Department of Labor, that would be a place to look. So there's a number of places, generally speaking, that you can look. But again, a lot of this law, in terms of the interpretation of the law, hasn't been worked out. And when you have legislation, one of the things that happens is people can interpret words differently, and that's why you need more guidelines. But we just haven't had enough time yet to get real definitive on some of this interpretive material. Got
it. Thanks, Dean. As always, this webinar is recorded. We'll have that on our website. Dean, if it's okay, we'll share your office number and email address for anyone who has follow-up questions. And
sure.
I hope that all of you can join us tomorrow. We're having a conversation at 10:30 with Lieutenant Governor and State Senator Jim Ananick, as well as Jeff Donofrio from the Unemployment Office to answer more of your questions around these topics. Again, that'll be tomorrow at 10:30. Attorney Dean Yotis, thank you again. And with that, have a great day.
Okay, thanks, Steve. You have a great day too. We'll see you.